Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. I thought I knew what love looked like. After 43 years of marriage, I believed it was supposed to feel like drowning in slow motion. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor hummed their familiar tune as I walked away from room 314 for what I thought would be the last time. My husband Arthur lay unconscious, machines keeping his failing heart beating while I whispered my final goodbye. The doctors had been clear about his prognosis, and I had been clear about mine. I couldn't watch him suffer anymore. My hands shook as I pressed the elevator button, my wedding ring clicking against the metal. 65 years old, and I felt ancient. The weight of nearly half a century spent sacrificing everything for a man who had slowly, methodically, crushed every dream I'd ever harbored, pressed down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I had almost made it to my car when I heard voices drifting from an open window above me. Two nurses, taking their smoke break on what must have been a third-floor balcony. Poor guy in 314, one of them was saying. Been married over 40 years, and his wife just walked out on him while he's dying. I pressed myself against the brick wall of the building, hidden in the shadows but close enough to hear every word. Really? That's awful. Though I have to say, I've seen her here a lot, and she never seemed particularly upset about his condition. Kind of cold, if you ask me. Right? And did you see her today? She looked almost relieved when she said goodbye. What kind of person abandons their spouse when they need them most? The first nurse took a long drag of her cigarette. I heard from Janet in billing that the wife has been asking a lot of questions about life insurance and assets. Makes you wonder if she's just waiting for him to die so she can cash in. My knees nearly gave out. The cruelty of their assumptions hit me like a physical blow. But it was the grain of truth in their words that really devastated me. Because they were right about one thing. I had been asking about insurance and assets. Not because I was greedy, but because I had no idea what I would do with the rest of my life once Arthur was gone. Arthur had always handled our money, made all the major financial decisions, treated me like a child who couldn't be trusted with important matters. I was about to become a widow with no idea whether I could afford to keep our house or if I would need to find a job at 65 after being out of the workforce for decades. Those nurses didn't know about the decades of emotional neglect that had preceded this moment. They didn't know about the slow erosion of my self-worth under his constant criticism and indifference. They didn't know that I had spent 43 years trying to earn love from a man who seemed incapable of giving it. I had been 22 when we met, fresh out of nursing school and eager to save the world one patient at a time. Arthur had been 30, already established in his accounting practice, confident and decisive, in ways that had seemed attractive to my uncertain young self. He had swept me off my feet, making me feel special and chosen. The early years had been good. Or at least I remembered them that way. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Arthur's career had flourished, and with success had come an expectation that I would be available to support his ambitions. Business dinners that required a well-dressed wife who could make small talk with clients. Weekend entertaining that demanded careful meal planning and flawless execution. Gradually, my own career had taken a back seat. When Arthur suggested I reduce my hours at the hospital to be more available for his needs, I had agreed. When he hinted that my work schedule was interfering with important social obligations, I had found ways to be more flexible. When he began making jokes about my dedication to other people's problems when I had a husband to take care of, I had started to question whether my commitment to nursing was selfish. The final blow had come when I was 42. I had been offered a position as head nurse in the cardiac unit, A dream job that would have allowed me to use all my skills in meaningful ways. When I excitedly shared the news with Arthur, his response had been swift and crushing. "Emily, be reasonable," he had said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "You know I need you available for the Mackenzie account dinner next month. And what about the country club fundraiser? You can't possibly take on more responsibility at work when you have obligations here." I had turned down the position. I told myself it was because I loved Arthur and wanted to support his success. But the truth was that I had been worn down by years of having my own dreams treated as inconveniences. Now, standing in the hospital parking lot, I realized that turning down that job had been the moment I stopped being Emily and became simply Arthur's wife. Everything that had followed had been a slow fade into invisibility. The next morning brought a call from the hospital. Arthur had taken a turn for the worse. His doctor suggested I come in to discuss end-of-life care options. Dr. Patterson met me in the family conference room, explaining that Arthur's heart function had deteriorated significantly overnight. "What would Arthur want in this situation?" he asked gently. "Did you two ever discuss his preferences?" The question hung in the air between us. What would Arthur want in 43 years of marriage? We had never had that conversation. He had never asked what I might want if I were in his position. In fact, he had never shown much interest in my thoughts about anything that mattered. He never liked to talk about death, I said finally. He always said it was morbid to plan for something that might never happen. I told Dr. Patterson I needed time to think, then walked back to Arthur's room. He lay exactly as I had left him. Tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. His face, relaxed in unconsciousness, looked younger somehow, revealing traces of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. That evening, I went home and sat in Arthur's study, surrounded by the evidence of his successful life. I opened his desk drawers, looking for financial documents. What I found instead was a folder labeled Personal Papers that contained a letter written in Arthur's careful handwriting, addressed to his lawyer but never sent. My hands shook as I read Arthur's words. He wrote about his regrets, his awareness that he had not been the husband I deserved, his fear that I had only stayed with him out of duty rather than love. He acknowledged that he had been selfish and demanding, that he had taken my sacrifices for granted and failed to support my dreams. The letter was a confession and an apology that he had apparently never found the courage to deliver. Reading it, I felt something shift inside me, a loosening of the tight knot of resentment I had carried for so long. Arthur had known. He had been aware of what our marriage cost me, even if he had been unable or unwilling to change. The next day, I brought the letter with me to the hospital. I sat beside Arthur's bed and read it aloud, my voice breaking as I reached the parts where he expressed genuine remorse. When I finished reading, I folded the letter carefully and placed it on his bedside table. "I found this in your desk," I said to his unconscious form. "I wish you had given it to me while you were still able to have this conversation." For the first time since his collapse, I cried real tears. Not for the man who was dying, but for the marriage we might have had if we had been brave enough to be honest with each other about our needs and fears and disappointments. Dr. Patterson found me there that evening. "Mrs. Miller, I have some news. Arthur's brain activity has diminished significantly over the past 24 hours. Even if we were able to stabilize his heart function, he would likely never regain consciousness. I think it's time to discuss transitioning to comfort care." I looked at Arthur's peaceful face. then at the machines that were breathing for him. What does comfort care mean? Exactly. We would remove the life support and focus on making sure he's not experiencing any pain or distress. Most patients in his condition pass away within a few hours once the machines are turned off. The moment I had been avoiding for days had finally arrived. He would hate this, I said, looking at the tubes and wires keeping him alive. He would hate being dependent on machines, hate having other people make decisions for him. He always said he wanted to die with dignity. My sister Margaret arrived the next morning, bringing with her a quiet strength that helped me feel less alone with the decision I had to make. When everything was ready, Margaret and I stood on either side of Arthur's bed. I held his right hand and whispered words of forgiveness and release. "It's okay to go," I told him. "You don't have to fight anymore. I'll be okay." The machines went silent one by one, leaving only the sound of Arthur's labored breathing. It took less than 30 minutes for his breath to slow, then stop altogether. When Dr. Patterson confirmed he was gone, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if a very long story had finally reached its natural conclusion. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements. Arthur's colleagues spoke at the service about his professional accomplishments. Friends shared memories of golf games and business dinners, painting a picture of a man who had lived fully and successfully. I listened with detached interest, as if they were describing someone I had known only casually. After the funeral, Margaret stayed with me for a week, helping me sort through Arthur's belongings. "What will you do now?" she asked as she prepared to return home. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I feel like I'm starting over at 65, which seems both terrifying and exciting." Margaret hugged me tightly. "You know, Em, I think you're going to surprise yourself. You've been so focused on taking care of Arthur for so long that you've forgotten how capable and strong you are." After Margaret left, I found myself alone in our house for the first time since Arthur's death. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed full of possibility. I started small, rearranging furniture and putting away photographs that belonged to a version of myself I no longer recognized. I opened windows that Arthur had preferred to keep closed, letting fresh air and sunlight transform rooms that had felt stagnant for years. In his study, I replaced his business books with mysteries and romance novels from the library. I moved my sewing machine from the basement to the window where the light was best. 3 weeks after the funeral, I did something that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I painted the living room a soft, cheerful yellow that Arthur would have hated. As I worked, covering the boring beige walls with color and warmth, I felt something awakening in me that I had thought was gone forever. It was joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy in making a choice based solely on my own preferences. The first few months of widowhood were a process of rediscovery. I relearned how to make decisions without consulting anyone else. How to eat dinner at whatever time I felt hungry. How to watch television programs that Arthur would have found boring. I bought groceries based on what I wanted to eat, rather than what would please him. I also began rebuilding social connections that had withered during my marriage. Arthur had never enjoyed spending time with my friends, so I had gradually lost touch with women who had once been important to me. Now I reached out to old nursing school classmates, tentatively rebuilding relationships that had been casualties of my marriage. One of those reconnections led to an unexpected opportunity. My former supervisor at the hospital called to tell me about a volunteer program that provided companionship to elderly patients who had no family visitors. The idea of returning to healthcare, even as a volunteer, sparked something in me that I hadn't felt in decades. I started with two patients, an elderly man recovering from hip surgery and a woman with dementia who had outlived most of her family. Spending time with them reminded me of why I had originally been drawn to healthcare. The deep satisfaction that came from providing comfort to people during their most vulnerable moments. My patient with dementia, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been a teacher before her retirement. In her lucid moments, she would tell me stories about her students and the joy she had found in watching young minds develop and grow. "You're a good daughter," she told me one afternoon, patting my hand with her paper-thin fingers. "You come to see me even when it's hard." I didn't correct her mistake. Instead, I held her hand and listened as she told me about the garden she used to tend. Her stories reminded me of the garden I had neglected during Arthur's final months. The flower beds that had once been my pride and joy. That weekend, I spent hours in my backyard, pulling weeds and assessing the damage from months of neglect. Some plants had died, but others had persevered. And I found shoots of green growth emerging from what I had thought was dead ground. As I worked, I felt a connection to something larger than myself. Spring became summer, and I settled into new routines that revolved around my own needs and interests, rather than someone else's schedule. I took a watercolor painting class at the community center. I joined a book club at the library, where I discovered that I had opinions about literature that were worth sharing. Most surprisingly, I began to think about dating again. Not seriously, and not immediately. But the idea that I might someday want to share my life with someone who actually valued my thoughts and feelings no longer seemed impossible. The breakthrough came 6 months after Arthur's death. During one of my regular visits with Mrs. Rodriguez. She was having a particularly clear day, and we were looking through a photo album. "This was taken at my retirement party," she said, pointing to a picture of herself surrounded by colleagues and students. "I was so afraid of retiring. Afraid that without my work, I wouldn't know who I was anymore." She looked up at me with eyes that were suddenly sharp and focused. "But you know what I discovered? I was still me. All the parts of myself that I thought were tied to being a teacher. They were actually just tied to being human. To caring about other people. To learning new things. To finding beauty in everyday moments." Her words hit me with unexpected force. I had spent so many years defining myself in relation to Arthur that I had forgotten I existed independently of that relationship. The woman who had loved nursing, who had dreams and ambitions and opinions worth hearing, hadn't died with my marriage. She had just been buried under decades of accommodation and compromise. That night, I sat in my yellow living room and made a list of all the things I wanted to do with whatever years I had left. I wanted to travel to places Arthur had never been interested in visiting. I wanted to take classes, learn new skills, maybe even return to nursing in some capacity. I wanted to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than duty and habit. 1 year after Arthur's death, I stood in that same hospital corridor where I had overheard those nurses discussing my coldness and apparent greed. I was there as a volunteer, bringing comfort to patients who had no one else to sit with them during their darkest hours. As I walked past the nurses' station, I wondered if any of them remembered the supposedly heartless woman who had walked away from her dying husband. If they could see me now, they would see something different. A woman who had learned that walking away from a toxic situation isn't abandonment. It's survival. A woman who had discovered that you can love someone and still recognize that the relationship is slowly killing essential parts of your soul. A woman who had found the courage to choose her own well-being over other people's expectations. I had loved Arthur. In my way. For as long as I was able. But I had also learned to love myself enough to build a life that honored both my capacity for compassion and my need for respect and autonomy. The Emily Miller who had walked out of this hospital a year ago had been broken and bitter. Worn down by decades of neglect and compromise. The Emily Miller who returned as a volunteer was whole in ways she had never been during her marriage. As I entered the room of my first patient that day, I carried with me the knowledge that true love, whether for another person or for yourself, should never require you to disappear. It should never ask you to sacrifice your dreams, your voice, or your sense of worth. And if it does, then the most loving thing you can do is walk away. Not in anger or revenge, but in recognition that everyone deserves better. The nurses had been wrong about me in every way that mattered. I hadn't been waiting for Arthur to die so I could cash in on his death. I had been waiting for permission to finally start living my own life. And when that permission finally came, I discovered that I had never lost the capacity for joy, for growth, for connection with others. I had simply forgotten how to access those parts of myself while trying to be the woman Arthur needed me to be. Now, at 66, I was finally becoming the woman I was meant to be all along. And she was beautiful, capable, worthy of love, and absolutely, gloriously free. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, drop a like and a comment, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our new content.